Hello, I'm Guy, and this is Guy Robot.
Hello! Well, carrying on from the last few videos I've done, I thought I would carry on having a look at my Gentoo system that I've set up. In the last video I did a run through of how I did my initial X installation. Now that was actually quite a few weeks ago now. Since then I've installed a whole bunch of different applications and I'm now using my Gentoo Linux machine as my main computer for all my tasks. So for those that are considering the switch from Windows or Mac OS to Linux, or even just curious how someone else is using their Linux distribution, I thought I would do a run through of how my physical system is set up and how I've got my Gentoo distribution set up, what kind of apps I use, how I use my workflow, what I use the different monitors for. Thought this might be interesting for you, so let's take a look at my system. So I think the first place to start with this is, what's my actual workspace look like? As I can show you all the desktops, but kind of what's it like to physically use this workstation, as that's a very important part of a setup for me. So I've only moved into this office a couple of months ago, and how I have this all set up, I thought I'd be planning around the new software install so it kind of matched together. So the main thing is I have a multi-monitor configuration expressly with 3 monitors. Now I have keyboard and mouse mainly slightly over to the right, and I tend to sit slightly over to the right using the other screens for additional information. Some people find this a bit weird and tend to want to have the 2 monitors with something central to it, but with a bezel I find that quite distracting. So I tend to use one monitor as a primary monitor and all the others as ancillary ones. This would be a more central location if I had all 3 monitors in the span. However, the top panel isn't identical and I find that then ruins the visual layout of the thing. So I find this works for me. There is a separate video on the actual build of my computer, which is over there, and there's lots more computer equipment on the floor and stashed around this room. This is what my Linux workstation looks like, so should we dive in and see how I use it? Well, the most obvious thing to say is that I'm using X11, specifically Xorg server, and I'm using XFCE4. I do plan on running Wayland at some point, but right now I just wanted to get everything up and running and configured before I start playing with Wayland. So how do I use X11? Well, the config files I had in my last video, I was talking through it. The only real difference is that I've made a few changes to my xinitrc file. So as you can see from my xinitrc file here, I have my keyboard map set. In fact, I have it set twice. I have once my standard keyboard set layout, and then I have it set for a Dvorak keyboard layout, because I am mad and I've decided I'd quite like to learn to do Dvorak keyboard layout as well. On top of that, I then have my Xrandr setting. Now the Xrandr setting configures my multi-monitor support and it lays out the specific locations of all of these. That syntax I got using a tool called Xrandr, which if I load it up here, you can see lets you drag, configure, move the different monitors, and then you can do save as to get the specific settings you want for Xrandr. You can either run it manually or you can do it in your xinitrc. Some window managers and tools have this built in. I'd rather have the flexibility to do this myself. The final thing I have here are some NVIDIA settings. Now what this does is deal with tearing with the terrible issues that you can get on the NVIDIA driver. Because of how I'm applying my Xrandr settings rather than being in a config, and because I have to do a config rather than other options because of the PCI issues I explained in the last video, that means I have to do my NVIDIA settings to set the composition pipeline here to deal with tearing issues. Once that's all done, start XFCE4, XFCE runs, bang, and you see my desktop. So I suppose the next thing to go through is, well, what do I actually have on each of these monitors then? So at the moment you're seeing my right hand monitor, which is kind of my main working monitor. The left hand monitor at any point in time tends to have ancillary information on. So if I am doing some work on my main monitor, I might have information about programming or additional debug windows for the coding on that one, or I might have something I'm reading and referring to at the same time. Then the other window that I have running at any moment in time is my top monitor. Now that's generally for my monitoring one. So you can see here I have all the different threads and processes that are running, so I can monitor my system with all 56 cores busy at the top. And I have nethogs to see kind of what network I/O is going on. So that tends to be running at any moment in time just so I've got a big glance of it. If I tend to be reading a big document, I tend to put that up there and kind of lean back on my chair because the angle works quite nice for reading if I make the font a bit bigger. So also a bit of reading. But the majority of what we're going to be looking at today is going to be over on my main monitor. As you've seen from the video so far, I have the XFCE panels set up on the right-hand side of my right monitor. I have it on the left-hand side of my left monitor, and I have it on the top of my other monitor. The idea being that they are the extremities of my screen. And I have mine set up a bit like the Windows 10 taskbar, whether you like it or not. So we have a button at the top to show the programs that are running. We have a couple of shortcuts to run commonly used applications. Then we have all running applications. My main monitor, I have all applications on. The other panels, I only have what's actually running at that screen. So if we go over to my left-hand monitor, you'll see that we've just got terminal window and OBS on that particular one, and we don't have all the other notifications at the bottom. So I also use Whisker Launch in XFCE rather than the standard launcher. I like it. I'm sorry if you think it looks a bit Windowsy, but I like it. And one of the reasons I like it is the same reason that I like the Windows Start menu ever since Vista, and that is I can type into it to run things and to find things, rather than clicking through, trying to find what I want to run. Do I want to run Arduino? How I tend to run things is I tend to go into it and I tend to start typing and whack enter. And I find that for me is the quickest way to launch applications. So as well as that, the other thing that I like being able to do is just bring up that launch wherever I am. So I have it key bound to control space, so I can do control space and I can type in part of what I want, and bang, there you are. It's loaded up on my monitor. Although annoyingly, the Arduino one always loads up in the middle of all three monitors. I have to say, for XFCE, I love Whisker as an add-on. I also like the theme I've got, which is kind of a nice dark theme. You'll see I've got transparency on everything, so my windows themselves, you can see the space background through Chrome. If I focus on Chrome, you lose that. The idea being that I give all of my windows some transparency when they're not focused. That way I can quickly and instantly tell which is my main window, and I can also see the nested hierarchy of windows behind them when I haven't got one active, if there's something else that's kind of underneath it. So if I'm there and I've got that, you can kind of, probably a really bad example with a terminal, but you can see that there's something else going on behind it pretty quickly. So I find that kind of useful. As you can tell, I've got Chrome for my web browser. I did try my Dory, but fundamentally I decided I was going to sell my soul to the devil for the ease of sync across platforms. Yeah. Revisiting that will maybe at some point. For now, I'm dealing with the fact that Google know absolutely everything about me. It might take me a while to get through that part and go fully open source when it comes to browsing, as I do like some of the add-ons for now. Got to admit that and be honest. I have Pigeon running, which is my chat client. I mainly use it for Google Hangouts and a couple of other ones so I can keep talking to people. That kind of just sits there running on my taskbar. Don't use it a huge amount these days. I don't use Skype or anything else. I tend to only use that. You might have seen my desk has got a bunch of Razer hardware for my keyboard, mouse, and rather geekily my mouse pad. So there is something called Polychromatic, which I use for that. So if I run Polychromatic, it just looks like the standard Windows one. Oops, you've all got my serial numbers now. Don't try and raise support tickets. They're all out warranty. Never mind. You can set up all the various things in here, do exactly as you would in the Windows world, but it's nice for being able to actually control it rather than messing around without having to put the settings in Windows or something. Nice open source bit of hardware there. So the main work I do is development on a day-to-day basis. So if we load Visual Studio Code, this is kind of like ish a Microsoft version of Sublime. So it lets me just open a folder. So if I go to my code folder, say I load up ZTK, I can open it up, get all the files on the left-hand side. It supports multiple different languages, code completion. You can also have nice build sets with it. It pretty much does everything you'd want a really lightweight code text editor to do. It's not a fully fledged IDE. I find it mainly useful for if I'm doing Python or a light bit of C development in Linux. On top of that, the other one that I tend to use in Linux as an IDE, is, we've already seen it, is Arduino IDE, which is horribly annoying as always, but hey, it kind of works. So if we load up an example of one, you can then see that we've got some work here I'm doing on my master's project at the moment. It's the most horrible of IDEs in the world, but it is fairly quick and dirty, and it's not like you create the most complex of programs when you're working on Arduino. I think the most I've ever had is about 10 files for a single one. And the last one that I have on here is my Android Studio. All I'm really using that for at the moment is for doing simple control apps to manage some of the Bluetooth things that I have on my Arduino, but via my Android phone, mainly for my master's dissertation. Again, this all just sits on my right-hand monitor. I don't really like Java programming, mainly because the tool sets are always horrible. Like, you saw how quickly everything else loads, and this is just, oh, come on, right, there we are. it's another IDE. It works, it's fine, it's functional, and most importantly, it's black. I hate white things, eye strain. So, do I want to exit? Yes, I definitely do. The other thing that I mainly do in the Linux world is video editing. So I have a few tools for that as well. So one is Audacity, which is exactly the same tool that I was using when I was in Windows. So Audacity, when I have it and I tend to do filming, tends to sit on my top monitor. I've brought it down to the main one for now. And it is a simple audio editor. I haven't got any audio inputs plugged in at the moment, I don't think. Do we have any audio plugged in? Oh, yes, we do. So there is a microphone plugged in at the moment. You can see it's recording the waveform for my voice. I can stop that. I can let's compress it to level out the audio. If I could remove some of the background noise if we wanted to, then I could start recording.
Yes, we do.
Ooh, so there we go. And then I can record another track on top of it. I do use this for doing audio editing. If I want to, I tend to, these days, record the audio directly with the video, but with a separate mic, and I can sync it up and do edits in this afterwards. Same tool I used to have on Windows. It's an open source tool. It's fantastic. The other tool that is a both Windows and Linux tool that's formed part of my tool set is Handbrake. I use this because when I record any video from my phone, what tends to happen is the variable frame rate on the thing, or variable bit rate rather, results in audio and video getting out of sync in certain video editors. So I can use this to just open a video, and then on here I can enforce that it will output it at a constant frame rate of 60, and that then allows it to be imported without the speech and video getting out of sync in a video editor. And finally, what do I actually use for video editing? This took a while for me to get used to. From Premiere Pro, trying to find anything was difficult. I ended up going with Lightworks, which I've actually paid for a license for. Didn't like any of the open source ones. I found they were a bit rubbish, but using Lightworks felt like a pretty good non-linear video editor. It offered all the functionality I wanted. It's fairly nice and easy to do edits on it. If I look at one of the other videos that I've had recently, we go into the install, it looks just like I'd expect to do. Lots of cuts, the ability to kind of scrub through it, jump to any point in time. You've got all the different edits. It's certainly not Premiere Pro, but it's good, it's reliable, it's free if you want to do 720p. If you want to do 1080p, which I do, then it's like $10 a month or something like that. Also, for doing export, really, really easy to do. Just export H.264, choose your frame rate, bang, done. Quicker than Premiere Pro for export on my system. I think Premiere Pro may be better in certain GPU scenarios, but with 56 cores, this thing works a hell of a lot better than Premiere Pro did. So I can now encode roughly a second of video for a second of elapsed time, where it used to be half that speed on Premiere Pro. So I quite like that. I looked at a whole bunch of other ones. I really wanted Davinci Resolve to work when the beta for that was released, but the problem with Davinci Resolve was that I couldn't do audio monitoring on the playback, which was really annoying without buying some extra card, which wasn't going to happen. So that one ended up getting thrown away. So my kind of flow on Linux now for video editing is Audacity, Handbrake, and then Lightworks to do the editing and touch-ups and get everything working together. Other tools I rely on a day-to-day basis, well, not so much tools. I have the obligatory VLC. Who doesn't use VLC? I've also got Spotify for listening to music as well, which works fine on Gentoo Linux, just the same as anything else. The binary on it is absolutely fine. Quite a few of these were binary install. Visual Studio Code was a binary install. Lightworks was a binary. Davinci Resolve. Some of these I've had to manually tweak and sort out individual libraries for. Could do an extra video on that at some point if anyone's got a particular thing they're interested in. But overall, most of this is source-based. The only other tools I tend to use are AppyWord, which is pretty much like Microsoft Word, really, really simple. I use it for basic text editing, if I want to do a bit of formatting, but nothing complicated. For any academic stuff, I tend to do all of my stuff in LaTeX, and I use Text Studio for that. So Text Studio is the same on Windows and Linux. It allows you to do LaTeX markup, get a PDF out of it. So that's something I'm working on at the moment. But I don't have a full Office suite on here. And that's because what else do I do is run virtual machines. Now, I use VMware Workstation. Although I have it here, I don't tend to actually have the UI running on it. The reason being that once I created my virtual machines, when I got the system set up and running, I then actually run everything from the command lines. So if we pull this over to the main monitor, you can see that I've got a domain controller and a build agent running on my computer, as well as a couple of Windows and a Ubuntu workstation that I also have running on here. And as well as that, I've also got my different ESX hosts on my network, which I'm connected to, so I can then manage individual virtual machines within each of these. So there we are. We can have a look at the different exciting things that are going on different virtual machines on my network at any point in time. And I like the fact that VMware Workstation integrates into my ESXi infrastructure. Yes, it's a commercial product. Yes, you have to pay for it. However, I've got a free license as a student, and I have a personal license. Before that, I've used VMware products for a long time. I don't pay for ESXi. I use the free version on that. However, for the actual workstation one, I do have the professional one. Now, it's not as good as the Windows edition of it, but it works pretty well. It's really easy to get up and running. The main thing I tend to use it for is my Windows virtual machine. I actually launch all my VMs on boot. So if we have a look at this, this is just a script that I have that runs at boot, which starts all my different virtual machines up without GUI. Unfortunately, that means you can't actually see them in the VMware Workstation GUI. Nicely done, VMware. But it does mean that I'm able to get them running at boot. So pretty much straight away, within a couple of seconds, Windows is up and running because I've got a crazy fast hard disk on it. And that takes me to how do I actually access and use my virtual machines, I guess. Well, X3RDP. So that's what this icon over here does. If I run X3RDP, what I then tend to do is go full screen as soon as it launches. And if I minimize all that crap that's on my desktop, you then see a very similar desktop to my Gentoo one. So Gentoo sidebar, Windows taskbar. Ooh, they're similar. And it means that actually, if I now go between, so this is now my Windows desktop on the computer, Linux desktop, go to my left-hand monitor, and then go to my Windows desktop, you'll see they kind of look identical and work together, and that's very much what I like. And on the one hand, I've got all my Windows productivity tools here, whilst with the click of a button, I'm then over and I'm into the world of Linux, and then I'm back into Windows. And I can even see Windows overlaid on top of Chrome, which is running on Linux behind it. It works really seamlessly for me. Now, I tend to use Windows for a couple of things. One is for Outlook and Office. I still don't believe there's anything that's a patch in the open source world on that. Feel free to disagree with me, but you're not going to convince me. I've tried it all. I still think Windows wins hands down there. And that takes on to the other things I tend to do for it. Well, I still use Paint.net for thumbnail generation, as I've yet to teach myself how to use GIMP effectively. And I can get around Paint.net pretty well. So for my thumbnail generation in Windows, I use Paint.net, which seems to work pretty well. I mean, I've got a fair amount of resources given to this virtual machine. So this virtual machine has got 16 cores associated with it. And 8 gig of RAM. I never really used that many. I did try video rendering on this, but it was terrible using Premiere Pro in a virtual machine, so I gave up on it. It took like the whole day to render a 40-minute video, so I'm never going to try that again. I don't have 3D graphics on it, other than the basic VMware one. There's no pass-through stuff on this. It is just kind of all virtual. But, you know, doing basic stuff, if I want to create a thumbnail on this, works absolutely fine. Or go to the layered version of it, you know, it works absolutely fine, like I'd expect it to. I don't feel any lag versus when I was using it natively. The other thing I tend to do on here is a lot of software development. So I still am quite a bit in the Windows world with a number of projects that I'm engaged with. Not completely in the Windows world, but certainly a large amount of it is. So if I load up one of my open source projects that I've got on GitHub here that I must admit I haven't touched in a good month now because I've been crazy busy for attempting to create a new Wayland graphics development kit, you will see that it's Visual Studio and it works fine. This is actually the first time I've loaded this solution since I've installed Visual Studio on here. The performance is as good as I'd expect on a new Windows system. I have no problems working in this in a virtual machine. The only thing that annoys me is I don't have multiple monitors set up. And Visual Studio I find works really well with, say, 3 monitors on large projects. I tend to have like debug stuff on one monitor. I tend to have my code editing on one and a couple of Visual Studio windows open on another one. It's an IDE that works really well with multiple monitors. So at the moment I'm only using one monitor for remote desktop on here. I could do multi-monitor remote desktop, but for switching them between Linux and Windows, it'd be a bit more annoying. What I have to do now is move my mouse over and click, and then bang, I'm back into the world of Linux, and then click, and I'm back into the world of Windows. So this paradigm works pretty well for me now. At some point in the future, I'm going to get KVM set up on Linux, which I've decided to go for over VMware and over Xen to do hardware pass-through, and at that point I'm going to have a physical switch for my monitors, keyboard, mouse, so that I press a button I can KVM between them for when I want to do either things that require hardware pass-through. I might switch back to Premiere Pro at that point, depending on how well I end up liking Lightworks, and also for multi-monitors with Visual Studio. The other thing, I mean, what else do I do on this computer? I do a fair bit of mining, so I have some CPU mining running at the moment for a particular coin. I have actually a whole bunch of virtual machines running at the moment, so I'm using a total of about 70 or 80 CPU cores across my network, doing some CPU mining, some hard disk mining. I have the wallets for that tending to run on Windows, and I tend to have the actual mining process running on Linux. And that pretty much is my day-to-day usage of my computer. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight. Space is cool, like the space background. Space tattoo, this will soon look like the background. I think that sums it up. Well, not sure if this is the kind of thing you're all interested in, but if it is, I also could do a run through of my whole office. There's a few other computers here, I've got some electrical stuff, got some old vintage computers, might be interesting to have a look at my office. I know this is a bit different than the technical hands-on I normally look at, but I normally quite enjoy poking around other people's desktops, so hopefully you may think the same. If you liked this video, please thumbs up and like it. If you thought it sucked and don't want me to do anything like this again, then hit dislike and let me know in the comments. You can check me out on Facebook and Twitter at GuyRobotTV, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks.